Every single day, roughly 20 million barrels of oil pass through a stretch of water, so narrow that on a map, it barely looks like a gap at all. A thin blue sliver separating Iran to the north from the UAE and Oman to the south. 33 miles at its widest, 21 nautical miles at its most critical point, and through those 21 miles flows 1/5 of the entire world's oil supply. Think about that for a moment. 1/5 of everything the planet burns, drives, flies, and builds with, squeezed through a corridor that in geographic terms is practically a rounding error. If that strait closes for even 72 hours, fuel prices spike globally. Supply chains fracture. Governments that spent decades building energy security suddenly realize they built it on a single thread. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane, it is the jugular vein of the modern global economy, and everyone knows it, especially the countries that sit right next to it. So when the UAE asked itself a question that most nations only dare to ask in classified briefings, and then actually answered it with 4,200 kilometers of steel pipe buried beneath the desert, the world should have paid more attention. Because what they built was extraordinary. And what it revealed about the limits of strategic planning is even more extraordinary. To understand why a country would spend $4.2 billion constructing a pipeline through one of the harshest landscapes on Earth, you have to understand the specific nature of the fear that drove it. Iran controls the northern coastline of the Strait of Hormuz. That geography alone gives Tehran a lever of almost unimaginable power. Whenever sanctions tighten, whenever American carrier groups move into the region, whenever diplomatic pressure builds, Iran reaches for that lever. They don't always pull it, but they hold it. And markets respond to the holding just as much as they would respond to the pulling. It happened in 1984 during the tanker war when both Iran and Iraq began targeting each other's oil shipments, and the strait became a live threat zone. It happened in 2011 when a senior Iranian military official publicly threatened to close the strait in response to Western sanctions. It happened again in 2019 when a series of tanker attacks near Fujairah and inside the Gulf of Oman rattled the entire shipping industry and sent insurance premiums spiraling. Each time, the world absorbed the shock, prices adjusted, and diplomacy eventually cooled the temperature. But the underlying vulnerability never changed. The strait remained what it had always been, a single point of failure wrapped in geopolitical tension, handling a volume of global commerce that no alternative could realistically replace. The UAE understood this better than almost anyone. Abu Dhabi sits at the western end of the Persian Gulf. Its oil fields are some of the most productive on the planet, and every barrel it exports has historically had to travel northeast, through the Gulf and out through Hormuz, before it can reach open ocean. The UAE had wealth, infrastructure, and ambition. What it didn't have was an exit that didn't require Iran's implicit cooperation. That is what ADCOP was built to provide. Construction on the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline began in 2008. The route runs approximately 400 kilometers from the Habshan oil fields in Abu Dhabi's interior, cutting east across the country through desert terrain that offers almost nothing in the way of natural advantage. No rivers, no established corridors, no easy geography, just heat, sand, and the engineering will of a government that had decided the risk of inaction outweighed the cost of construction. The pipeline's destination was deliberate and precise. Fujairah, a port city sitting on the UAE's eastern coastline facing the Gulf of Oman rather than the Persian Gulf. Oil arriving in Fujairah is already past Hormuz. It never entered the strait to begin with. From Fujairah, tankers can load and sail directly into open ocean, heading east toward India, China, Japan, and South Korea without ever passing within range of the chokepoint. By 2012, ADCOP was operational. At peak capacity, it could move between 1.5 and 1.8 million barrels of crude oil every single day. Pumping stations distributed along the route maintained pressure across the full 400 kilometers. Storage terminals at Fujairah could hold oil in reserve, providing a buffer against disruptions on either end. The port itself was expanded specifically to handle the new volume. For Abu Dhabi, which produces around 3 million barrels per day, this meant that roughly half its output had a genuine alternative route to market, not a theoretical route. not a contingency plan written in a government document and never tested. An actual pipe in the actual ground moving actual oil. When it launched, regional analysts called it one of the smartest pieces of energy infrastructure built in the 21st century. They were right. They were also, in a way they couldn't fully anticipate, describing only half the picture. Because here is the number that ADCOP cannot escape, no matter how well it functions. 20 million barrels per day pass through the Strait of Hormuz. ADCOP carries 1.8 million. Even operating at absolute maximum capacity, the pipeline handles less than 10% of the strait's total daily flow. The UAE's bypass works for the UAE. For the Gulf region as a whole, Hormuz remains as irreplaceable as it ever was. Saudi Arabia has no equivalent pipeline reaching a port outside the Gulf, neither does Kuwait, Iraq, or Qatar. Their oil remains entirely dependent on the strait. So in any serious crisis, even a fully functioning ADCOP doesn't stabilize global markets. It stabilizes one country's exports while the rest of the region's supply sits stranded, reroutes around the Cape of Good Hope on voyages adding weeks and enormous cost, or simply stops moving. When that crisis arrived in 2026 and shipping through Hormuz came under genuine threat, the UAE activated the pipeline. Oil flowed east. Tankers loaded at Fujairah and departed safely into the Gulf of Oman. By the narrow measure of whether ADCOP did its job, the answer was yes. It did exactly what it was designed to do. But the Gulf's broader oil infrastructure had no equivalent answer. Prices climbed, supply chains tightened. Buyers who had assumed Hormuz would always remain open discovered how thin their assumptions actually were. And the UAE, watching its pipeline function while its neighbors struggled, found that being the best prepared country in a regional crisis still doesn't mean you escape the consequences of that crisis entirely. Then came the complication that no bypass can fully account for. Fujairah came under threat. This is the fundamental paradox of infrastructure resilience in a conflict zone. When you build around one vulnerability, you do not eliminate risk, you relocate it. Fujairah had long been considered safely removed from the Persian Gulf's tensions, geographically separated, commercially neutral, not an obvious military target. That assumption held during normal times. It began to erode as the 2026 crisis expanded beyond its original scope. We had seen early warnings of this logic before. In 2019, several tankers near Fujairah were attacked in what investigators described as deliberate acts of sabotage. At the time, the incident was treated as an outlier, a message perhaps, or a probe, but the message it contained was precise. The alternative route is not invisible. The backup is not untouchable. If an adversary is motivated and capable enough, they do not need to block the strait. They can simply make the bypass unusable instead. As the 2026 conflict widened, ports, storage terminals, refineries, and logistics networks all became part of a broader strategic calculation. Infrastructure that had seemed peripheral to any military objective became central to it. The pipeline kept pumping, but a pipeline that delivers oil to a port that cannot safely load ships has reached the end of its usefulness. One choke point had been bypassed. Another had been created in its place. So what does ADCOP actually teach us? It teaches us that partial solutions are not the same as resilient ones. The pipeline was built with genuine strategic foresight. It was funded at enormous cost, constructed through difficult terrain, and completed on schedule. It worked. In the narrowest sense of that word, it worked. But resilience is not a single backup plan. Resilience is a system designed to absorb shocks arriving from multiple directions in multiple forms at unpredictable times. It requires redundant routes, not one alternative. Distributed infrastructure, not a new concentration of risk at a different location. Flexible systems that can adapt when the nature of the threat changes rather than systems optimized for one specific failure mode. The world has learned this lesson before and forgotten it repeatedly. After 2022, Europe discovered that decades of energy dependency on a single supplier left almost no flexibility when that supplier became an adversary. The response required dozens of simultaneous moves across multiple countries, fuel types, and supply chains. Not one pipeline, not one terminal, an entire system rebuilt under pressure. ADCOP is a monument to intelligent long-term thinking. Most governments never build what the UAE built, because the benefits are invisible until the crisis arrives, and the political will to fund infrastructure that might never be needed is almost impossible to sustain. The UAE sustained it, because that matters, but it is also a monument to the limits of solving a systems-level problem with a single-point solution. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a geographic feature, it is a reflection of how deeply interconnected and how deeply fragile the architecture of global energy really is. You cannot build a pipeline around that fragility. You can only manage it layer by layer until the layers are deep enough to hold. Whether the Gulf region ever builds those layers remains, for now, an open question. If this kind of deep dive into the hidden systems that run our world is something you're into, you're going to want to subscribe and hit the bell, because we cover things like this every day: the engineering failures, the geopolitical pressure points, and the fragile, invisible infrastructure that most people never think about until it breaks. Thanks for watching.